They say the suburbs of Utah sleep under a quiet sky, that nothing truly sinister survives beneath the trimmed lawns and the warm porch lights. I used to believe that. Then the night the call came in about a man named Eric Richins, I learned how wrong a detective can be. His death was the kind that doesn't raise alarms at first glance. A husband found unresponsive in his bed. No signs of a break-in. No weapon, no struggle. Just a man who went to sleep and never woke up. A tragedy that fits too neatly inside the lines of ordinary life. But when life looks ordinary for too long, that is when you start to suspect the rot beneath the paint. By sunrise, I stood in that quiet house on the hill where the wind didn't bother whispering through the windows. His wife, Eric Richins, told the responding officers the story everyone tells when death comes quietly. They had celebrated a business deal. She made him a drink, a Moscow Mule, the suburban cocktail of choice. She went to check on the kids. When she came back, he was cold. The paramedics arrived too late. And the house, with its soft carpet and tastefully chosen furniture, swallowed the rest of the night like nothing had happened. You learn to feel atmospheres as a detective. Houses carry emotions the way soil carries water. This one felt off, too still, too staged, like a photograph of a family that once existed rather than the family itself. Every item felt placed with intention, including the glass on the counter that still smelled faintly of ginger beer and citrus. But there was something else clinging beneath the scent, a whisper of chemical bitterness. Toxicology reports are usually routine, a box on a form you check because procedure demands it. But when the results came back on Eric's sample, the air in the room thinned. The lab tech looked at me like I already knew the truth. A concentration of fentanyl so pure and so strong it could have killed 5 men. Eric never stood a chance. People rarely expect poison. It is old-world murder, something from Victorian novels and bitter wives with arsenic in their aprons. But fentanyl is the contemporary answer to those older schemes. Invisible, potent, easy to disguise. Easier to blame on addiction, even when the victim has never touched drugs in his life. That was the first fracture in Curry's story. The next came soon after. While the world mourns differently, grief has a rhythm one detectives recognize. Hers was out of tune, too composed, too curated. When she spoke of him, her eyes moved, but her voice didn't shift. Emotion is a tide. Hers was a still pond reflecting only what she wanted us to see. Later, we found out that months before the murder, Eric had fallen violently ill on several occasions after eating meals prepared by his wife. He confided in close friends that he suspected she was trying to poison him. When a man says something like that, most people dismiss it as paranoia. But the dead aren't paranoid. They are precise. We pulled her phone records. People always think their phones are vaults. They are not. They are confessionals with timestamps. Hidden among her messages was a thread with a local dealer where she purchased what she called pain pills. Then she asked for something stronger, stronger than the batch before, stronger than what any normal person would ever need. When detectives read requests like that, the temperature in the room changes. Every word becomes a bloodstain the suspect didn't know they left behind. And then there was the book. After Eric died, Curry wrote a children's book about coping with the death of a father. Pages filled with soft illustrations, gentle metaphors crafted to soothe. But the truth has sharp edges, and they cut through every line she tried to soften. A grieving widow writing a guide for children could have been touching. In this case, it dripped with performance. A narrative built to shield her, not the children it claimed to comfort. Everyone in this town wanted to believe her. Suburbs reward illusion, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect home. But when you work homicide long enough, you know perfection is the mask people wear right before everything collapses. I revisited the kitchen the next week, the Moscow Mule origin point, the last drink of a doomed man. Sunlight pooled across the counter where the glass had once stood. You could almost picture Eric lifting it to his lips, unaware that the woman he trusted most had already decided he would not live to see morning. A marriage is a private country. What lives inside it is known only to the two people who built it. But money has a way of redrawing the borders. Kuri had debts, failed deals, a need for control that grew more desperate each month. And there was a life insurance policy she had tried to claim almost immediately after Eric's death. A policy he had secretly changed years prior, removing her as the beneficiary and leaving everything to his sister. Another sign that he feared the storm brewing inside his own home. As I sat there in that silent kitchen, I realized something. Murder in the suburbs isn't loud. It doesn't come with gunshots or sirens or screams that split the night. It comes wrapped in routine, a drink shared between husband and wife, a bedtime that never ends, a heart that stops quietly while the rest of the world sleeps. But the truth is never quiet. It reverberates beneath the floorboards until someone is willing to listen. This case was only beginning. I could feel the weight of it settling into my bones. Cases like this don't end with arrests or indictments. They end when every lie is peeled back and the core is exposed. And I knew the core of this one would not be easy to look at. The story of the Richins family would unfold into one of the darkest investigations I have seen in years. A woman who built a narrative of innocence while standing on a foundation of deception. A man who sensed his death long before it came. And a community forced to confront the truth that evil doesn't need to hide in alleys or shadows. Sometimes it lives across the hallway, sharing your bed, wearing a wedding ring. As I left the house that day, the wind finally stirred, brushing against the windows with a soft breath. It sounded like a warning, whispered too late, and this was only the beginning. Morning in Summit County has a way of pretending everything is fine. Light settles gently over the mountains, the kind of light that looks like forgiveness, like a reset button pressed every dawn. But for a detective, mornings do not cleanse anything. They illuminate details the night tried to bury. The day after the toxicology report confirmed the presence of fentanyl in Eric Richins. I drove back to the place where it all began. The Richins house stood on the edge of a quiet road lined with pine trees that swayed just enough to sound like whispers. Houses like these are monuments to the American promise. A good life, a good marriage, a good death would be old age and grandchildren, not a poisoned cocktail left cooling on the counter. Inside, the air held the faint, sterile scent left by paramedics. It mixed with the ghost of ginger beer and lime that still clung to the kitchen. I traced the steps from where Kuri claimed she stood while making the drink to the bedroom where Eric took his final breaths. The distance was short. Murder rarely requires grand gestures. Sometimes it travels only a few feet. What lingered most was Eric himself. In homicide, you do not meet victims the way most people do. You meet the outlines they leave behind, the imprints on their furniture, the choices in their closets, the rhythm of their daily routines. These reflections tell you who they were and often whisper who they feared. Eric's brother met me outside later that morning. His shoulders carried the weight of something deeper than shock. It looked like confirmation, like a man who had been waiting for news he prayed would never come. He told me Eric had confided in him quietly, cautiously, like a man tiptoeing around the truth because he feared it would devour him. Eric believed someone close to him was trying to harm him. Not a stranger, not a passerby, someone inside his own home. When his brother said he thought Eric was being paranoid, Eric answered with a kind of shaken certainty that stays with an investigator. He said, "If something happens to me, look at Corey." The words lodged under my ribs like a splinter. Suspicion is a seed, but fear is the soil that allows it to grow. Eric had been afraid, and fear is rarely wrong. The next step was to retrace Corey's story. Detectives relearn the world through contradictions. We listen for the details that do not fit the shape of the narrative. She said she celebrated a business victory that night, but her phone records showed no messages about a closed deal. She said she brought him the drink and then left the room to tend to one of their children, but there were no signs any child had awakened that night. She said she found him cold hours later, but the timeline contradicted the temperature calculations from the medical examiner. Narratives stretch. Lies snap. In the following days, search warrants opened doors people prefer to keep permanently locked. Electronic devices, financial records, insurance documents, text messages. The modern blueprint of someone's private life. There is always a moment in every investigation when the mask comes off and the truth begins to take shape like frost on glass. The dealer she contacted became the next thread. His interview was reluctant at first. Dealers have their own rules, their own loyalties, but they also understand mortality better than most. He admitted to selling her fentanyl disguised as pills. She had asked for more than before, stronger than before, enough to make even a hardened dealer raise an eyebrow. No one buys that quantity without a purpose. When I pressed him on why he sold it anyway, he looked ashamed, but unsurprised. Money alters ethics. Need alters choice. He did not know Eric, so his conscience was spared until now. He stared at the floor when he said he remembered the look in her eyes. Determined, focused. He thought she was trying to get high. He never imagined she was planning a death. The timeline tightened around her, the way noose tightens around a neck. Purchases, illnesses, arguments, financial motives. The mosaic was forming piece by jagged piece. But while evidence builds cases, it is behavior that builds understanding. The question that pressed at the back of my mind was not just how she did it, but why. Not the surface why. Not the insurance money or the debts or the house she wanted. Those are reasons, not motives. Motives live deeper in the shadows of who a person truly is. I found myself driving to a nearby park one afternoon where Eric had been seen playing with his children months before his death. Parents pushed strollers along the pathways. Kids laughed in the distance. It was the kind of scene that should bring peace, but instead it cast a darker contrast against the tragedy I was chasing. I imagined him standing there watching his kids climb a jungle gym, knowing silently that something in his life was unraveling. That the wife he once trusted might be the storm approaching. A man senses when the ground beneath him shifts. Eric sensed it too late. Back at the office, financial records spelled out the cracks in their marriage. Corey had attempted to take out large insurance policies on Eric without his consent. She had tried to claim benefits he had already redirected to his sister. She had been drowning in debts he did not know about. Money is not the root of all evil, but it is often the accelerant. The more we uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Attempts at poisoning disguised as sudden illnesses. Google searches about lethal dosages. Deleted conversations. The way she spoke of her husband, not with sorrow, but with utility. Language reveals truths people do not intend to say. That night I sat alone at my desk long after the rest of the department had gone home. The lamp cast a dim cone of yellow light across the reports. The darkness beyond the lamp felt heavy, like the case itself was leaning over my shoulder. I reread Eric's final hours. The drink, the silence, the cold. It takes a certain kind of person to commit murder. It takes a colder kind of person to sleep peacefully afterward. And it takes an even colder one to write a book about grief while hiding the cause of the grief she claims to understand. The most haunting murders are not committed by monsters in the dark, but by people who smile in photographs. People who know your favorite meals, your secrets, your weaknesses. People you trust to hold your life while you sleep. Khoury's story was unraveling faster now, threads snapping one by one, but the darkest part was still ahead. Soon we would uncover the attempts before the final attempt. The nights Eric believed he had cheated death, only to realize death had merely been testing him. By the end of that week, I knew this was not just a story about murder. It was a story about a man who predicted his own fate and was powerless to stop it. A story about a woman who built her life on facades and found her lies collapsing beneath her. This was no longer an investigation. It was a descent into a truth sharp enough to draw blood, and the descent had only just begun. There is a point in every investigation when the shadows stop hiding and begin to speak. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough for a detective to hear the truth brushing against the edges of the case. By the time we reached that point in the death of Eric Richins, the entire story began to shift beneath our feet like soil giving way under a rotting foundation. It started with a date, February 26th. On paper, it looked like nothing more than another winter evening in Utah. But on her phone, in a thread she thought she had erased, was the digital fingerprint of intent. The purchase of fentanyl. Not the first batch, not the only batch, but the one that painted the clearest picture of what she was becoming. Her contact with the dealer had been brief but chilling. A request for something stronger, something that could not be mistaken for anything but a weapon. Investigators learn early that murderers rarely begin with certainty. They start with hesitation. Testing, observing, adjusting. Before the night she finally succeeded, there were signs she had tried and failed. Nights when Eric fell sick so violently that he questioned the food set before him. A vacation in Mexico where a drink handed to him nearly sent him to the hospital. Episodes of fear disguised as food poisoning. Each attempt building toward the final one. Fear is supposed to protect a man, but fear without proof is a prison. Eric lived inside it. His friends told us he had begun sleeping with one eye open. He checked the locks twice, kept conversations short, spoke about his wife in a tone caught somewhere between love and dread. He did not want to believe the danger he sensed. Belief makes danger real, and fear whispers one question louder than any other. What if I am right? I stared at the timeline on my office wall. Attempts, illnesses, purchases, arguments, financial betrayals. It formed a shape, a curve downward toward inevitability of her steps. The descent of Khoury Richins. Of her steps, the descent of Khoury Richins was undeniable. The most chilling pieces came from interviews with those who knew the couple. They described a marriage that had once looked bright, then cracked like glass under pressure. Eric had begun hiding his finances. He trusted his sister with the documents he once shared openly with his wife. He changed the beneficiary of his life insurance policy quietly, silently, as if preparing for a future without knowing whether he would survive long enough to see it. When we interviewed Eric's sister, she brought out the paperwork he had entrusted to her. She placed it on the table like a sacred relic. Insurance form. A will. A handwritten note he once gave her that said, If anything happens to me, make sure the boys are okay. The handwriting was steady, but the fear behind it trembled across the page. Cases like this do not simply involve a killer and a victim. They involve a community slowly waking up to a truth it wishes it never had to face. Friends who replay conversations they dismissed, family members who ignored warning signs. A town forced to see that evil sometimes walks in daylight and waves to the neighbors. The next breakthrough arrived not from files or statements, but from a moment of brutal clarity. We recovered data fragments from her phone, deleted searches, pages she visited late at night when she believed the world was too dark to watch her. Questions typed into her browser with a cold precision. How much fentanyl does it take to kill someone? Can you overdose from fentanyl without knowing? What is the lethal dose of illicit fentanyl? Each search another drop of poison into the river of evidence. No one searches those questions casually. No one buys fentanyl in secret for innocent reasons. No one watches their spouse convulse in pain and attributes it to coincidence. These were not accidents. These were rehearsals. While the digital evidence revealed calculation, the behavioral evidence revealed something far darker. After Eric's death, she moved with a calmness that disturbed even seasoned investigators. She contacted insurance companies within days. She attempted to claim a policy she did not legally control. She began searching for properties to purchase as if death had been a financial inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Then she wrote a book about grief, about healing, about children learning to accept the loss of a parent. The gesture would have been tragic if it were genuine. Instead, it stained the air around her like smoke from a fire she had set herself. We learned that on the night of the poisoning, she told friends that she and her husband had celebrated a business win together. She spoke brightly about their future. She smiled. But when we examined her financial records, we found no such victory, no deal, no success, just a mountain of debt and failed investments pressing against her from all sides. Desperation is the architect of many crimes, but desperation alone does not turn a person into a murderer. What does is the cold decision to remove an obstacle. In her life, that obstacle was her husband. One evening, after weeks of chasing threads, I returned to the Richins' house once more. This time I stood alone in the kitchen with the lights off. Darkness is honest. It strips everything of decoration. In that stillness, I imagined the moment she stood there making his drink. The clink of ice against copper, the hiss of ginger beer. A cocktail prepared not with love, but with calculation. She may have smiled when she carried it to him. Murderers often do. Upstairs, the bedroom remained unchanged. The impression of his body on the mattress had long since been smoothed by investigators, but the memory of it lingered like a bruise on the room itself. I stood in the doorway, imagining him drinking the cocktail she placed in his hands. Trust makes a person vulnerable. Marriage makes that vulnerability absolute. Eric walked into that final night without armor. The haunting part is that he expected something to happen. He sensed it. He told people. But sensing danger is not the same as escaping it. The tragedy of this case is not only that he died, it is that he predicted his death and still could not outrun it. I left the house with a weight in my chest that felt like borrowed grief. Some cases press themselves into your skin. This was one of them. The deeper we dug, the more I understood that we were not just uncovering a murder. We were uncovering a collapse of humanity inch by inch. And yet the worst part of the story had not surfaced. Not yet. The premeditation, the financial betrayals, the concealed purchases, these were only layers. Beneath them lay a colder truth, a motive not of anger, but of removal. She did not kill from passion. She killed to proceed. By the time Part 3 of this investigation closed, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Eric's death was not a moment of madness. It was a destination she had been walking toward for months. And now, finally, we were walking toward her. There comes a moment in an investigation when the truth stops resisting. It doesn't surrender gracefully. It fractures. It splinters. It groans under the weight of its own contradictions until the final structure of the lie collapses in on itself. That moment arrived the week we traced the last of the financial trails that led straight to Eric Richins. The document spread across my desk looked harmless at first glance, but paper has a way of telling stories louder than people do. Bank transfers, denied insurance claims, secret credit lines opened without her husband's knowledge. A map of desperation drawn in ink and numbers. The deeper we read, the more obvious it became that money was not merely a problem for her. It was the air she breathed, the engine she relied on, the thing she believed could save her from the collapse she saw coming. And when she realized that her husband was no longer a financial resource, but an obstacle, the mathematics of her choices changed. Investigators spend years learning to separate motive from impulse. The death of Eric Richins was no impulsive act. It was calculated, cold. A decision made through months of shifting strategies. The earlier poisonings were attempts not only to kill, but to test. How much could she give him without arousing suspicion? How sick could she make him without bringing him to the hospital? How close could she come to the edge without falling off? One evening I sat across from another friend of Eric's. The man folded his hands slowly, as though bracing himself for the truth he had tried to ignore. He told me that Eric once confessed he kept hiding cash around the house. Not because he distrusted banks, but because he distrusted his wife. He feared she would drain what he had left. He feared she saw him less as a partner and more as an account she could empty. The tragedy is that he was right. By the time we reviewed the last of the records, we discovered she had attempted to take out nearly $2 million in insurance policies on Eric. All without his consent. All declined. All pointing to a woman who had already begun imagining a future without him. A future paid for in the currency of his death. The nights grew longer as we pressed deeper into the investigation. I found myself returning to the image of that kitchen counter, the copper mug, the cold precision of a woman who believed she deserved more than she had. The suburbs present themselves as sanctuaries, but sometimes they are graves with better landscaping. Every street, every porch light, every trimmed lawn felt like a reminder that evil doesn't need shadows to hide. It only needs routine. The next morning, we interviewed the babysitter. A soft-spoken young woman who worked for the family occasionally. She told us something small, almost unremarkable, until we understood its context. She said that on one of the nights Eric had fallen violently ill, she heard Eric say she didn't know what was wrong with him, but hoped he could sleep it off. That detail alone meant nothing. But combined with the timeline, it meant everything. A man had been fighting for his life, while the person who poisoned him walked calmly through her home, trusting that the dosage was not yet perfect. That she could try again. The most chilling part of a poisoner's mind is not the method. It is the patience. A detective learns to quiet his own emotions, but this case pulled at something deeper. There are murders committed in rage, murders committed in fear, and murders committed in a moment of passion. This was none of those. This was an erasure, a removal, a calculated subtraction from her life. In the days that followed, the interviews became the architecture of the truth. Eric's mother described the last months of her son's life as heavy, as though he carried something invisible. She told us he grew quieter, warier. He withdrew from the people he once trusted. A man bracing for a blow, he could not name. She recalled a day when he showed her the insurance policies he had taken out for his children, the ones he made sure did not include Kuri. He told her that a storm was coming, but he didn't know when. She asked him what he meant. He answered with a single sentence that stayed with me long after the interview ended. He said, "I don't know how to protect myself from someone I promised to love." I left that interview with a silence so sharp it bordered on pain. Back at the station, my team had uncovered more from her digital activity. Searches about inheritance, searches about what happens legally when a spouse dies suddenly, searches about couples where one partner dies under suspicious circumstances. The computer logs painted her state of mind more clearly than any witness could. Then came the most revealing discovery. Timeline reconstruction showed that on the night of the murder, she had left her phone untouched for a suspicious block of time. No messages, no searches, no movement on her apps, a blackout. Investigators know what that means. It means the person wanted to leave no trace of what they were doing. But silence can be evidence too. It tells you exactly when a suspect switched from planning to acting. She claimed she was in her child's room during that period, comforting them after a nightmare. But data pulled from the home's Wi-Fi system showed no movement from the hallway or bedrooms during that time. In other words, the house itself contradicted her. Truth has a way of finding witnesses, even without people. Sometimes the walls testify. Late one night, I returned again to the board where we tracked every detail. Eric's face watched over the timeline, the man who had sensed his own end long before it arrived. I thought about the drink he was handed, the trust he still gave her, despite the fear gnawing at him. The children sleeping in their rooms while their mother prepared the end of their father's life. Murder is not always loud. Sometimes it is a whisper of intent behind a closed door. Sometimes it is a woman standing in a kitchen stirring a drink that she knows will carry a man past the threshold of his final dawn. As part 4 unfolded, one truth became unavoidable. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't lost control. She hadn't made a mistake. She had followed a plan methodically built across months of testing, acquiring, adjusting. A plan that saw her husband not as a person, but as an obstacle between her and the life she believed she deserved. Eric's death was not the collapse of her world. It was the foundation of the one she wanted to build. And now the walls of that world were beginning to crack. The final stage of any investigation is never the arrest. People outside this world believe that cuffs are closure, that once a suspect is taken into custody, the shadows retreat and the truth stands in the open. But the truth has its own temperament. It does not emerge because we demand it. It comes slowly like something rising from deep water, still dripping with everything it tried to hide. By the time we entered the last chapter of the death of Eric Richins, the truth had already surfaced long enough for everyone to see it. The world simply needed to accept it. I remember the morning the final warrant came through. The station was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests the storm is waiting just beyond the windows. She had been carefully constructing her life in the aftermath of the murder, shaping narratives, giving interviews, writing a children's book about death and healing. Each act sharpened the contrast between the story she wanted to tell and the reality she had created. We stood outside her home just after sunrise. The air was thin, the light low. The kind of dawn that makes a detective feel like he's walking into the ending long before the ending arrives. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. People like Eric Richins often believe they can outmaneuver consequences right until the moment the consequences appear. Then their faces go still, as if their mind is rewriting the world around them to fit the version they prefer. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted. A room can sense guilt the way a dog senses fear. The walls seemed to lean in waiting. The chair she sat in looked too small for the persona she tried to project. She spoke softly at first, carefully, the way a woman speaks when she still believes she can manage the narrative. She said she loved her husband. She said she never touched drugs. She said the accusations were built from misunderstandings. Then we placed the evidence in front of her. The timeline, the digital searches, the messages to the dealer, the financial motive, the insurance attempts, the earlier poisonings disguised as illness, the autopsy report with its lethal concentration of fentanyl, and the silence on her phone the night her husband died, a silence that carried more weight than any confession could. She looked at the pages the way a person looks at broken glass, knowing it reflects a version of themselves they cannot escape. She didn't break. Breaking requires emotion. What she did was retreat. Her eyes moved, but her voice stayed calm. She denied every connection, every implication, every inch of the truth pressing in on her. The calmness was not innocence. It was surrender cloaked in politeness. It's strange how some murderers crumble when confronted while others harden. She hardened, and a hardened suspect is easier to read. Their lies grow sharper, clearer, more defined, like a path that leads straight to the motive they think is well hidden. The public reaction grew louder as news of the investigation spread. A community lifted the veil from its collective memory. The perfect mother was suddenly a stranger. The woman who wrote a book about grief became the embodiment of its cause. And the children she claimed to be comforting were now orphans of a truth too heavy for them to understand. I found myself returning often to the evidence board late at night, studying the path that had led us here. Eric's warnings, his preparations, his quiet fear, the friends who didn't believe him until it was too late, the marriage that had become a battleground without outward signs of war. The way the final days unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy no one could stop. Closing a case like this is never satisfying. Murder removes satisfaction from justice. At best, we restore a portion of truth to a world that had been misled. At worst, we simply name the darkness that already won. But the moment the arrest warrant was issued, something in the air shifted, not relief, not victory. A kind of somber acceptance, the kind you feel at the end of a long funeral. I once heard someone say that poisoners are the loneliest killers. They do not lash out in fury or passion. They plan, they wait, they smile while they measure out the end of another person's life. Their killings are quiet, private, intimate. They sit inches away from their victim while death begins its work. They watch the person they once shared a home with fall into sickness, then into silence, then into nothing. And still they tell themselves they are not monsters. The truth, however, does not take sides. It only reveals. In the weeks that followed her arrest, the media descended on the case. The image of the grieving widow and author of a children's book shattered under the weight of toxicology reports and text messages. Each new detail added another fracture to the facade she had built. The world watched as the story shifted from heartbreak to horror. I revisited the Richins' home one final time before closing the file. Homes remember their endings. The walls felt colder now, stripped of illusion. The copper mug on the counter was gone, collected as evidence long ago, but its absence was as loud as its presence had once been. Objects hold memory even when they are removed. The floor beneath my feet felt heavier, as if the house itself exhaled the truth it had been forced to contain. Standing there, I thought of Eric. His attempts to protect himself, his fear, his children, his final moments. There is always a moment in every case when the victim stops being a figure in a file and becomes a person you carry with you long after the investigation ends. Eric became that person. Before I walked out, I turned and looked once more at the empty kitchen. It felt like the quiet after a storm created not by nature, but by one person's choice. Evil is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is methodical, sometimes it is patient, sometimes it wears the face of someone who kisses you goodnight. The case closed with the weight of inevitability. But closure is a myth detectives tell themselves to keep moving. Cases like this follow you long after the paperwork is done. They sit with you. They whisper. They remind you that trust is the most dangerous substance a person can swallow. And as I stepped out into the cold Utah air, only one truth remained. She didn't just end her husband's life. She rewrote the future of everyone who loved him. Some murders echo. This one will echo for years. This is the end of the case and the beginning of its haunting.